All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jordan Money. I'm the Director of Events and Communications at the Center for Security Studies and Security Studies program, and I'm very excited to be introducing you to the first of our lunch talks for the spring semester on the theme of security around the world. Just a few quick notes for you before I turn it over to today's speaker. First, you should be muted. You should have been automatically muted when you joined the Zoom session. Please do, we're all familiar with Zoom etiquette at this point, but do remain on mute unless you're asking a question so that we don't have any background noise. You are welcome to have your camera either on or off for the session, and we do definitely encourage it for the Q&A portion so that our speaker can engage a little bit more with the audience. On that note, we will have plenty of time for Q&A later on. Go ahead and hold your questions until that point. But when we get there, you can either use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I will call on you to ask your question out loud, or you can send your question to me in the chat, and I will ask it for you. Again, please hold on to your questions, but if you're having any tech issues or anything like that, go ahead and send me a chat as well. And then finally, this session is being recorded. So keep in mind that anything you say, questions that you ask will be recorded as well, as will your video if you choose to turn it on while speaking. We are only recording speaker view and the shared screen, so if you have your camera on while you're not speaking, you won't be recorded. We're not recording the whole grid or anything like that. So with all of that out of the way, I'd like to introduce today's distinguished speaker. Geoffrey Gresh is a professor of international security studies at the National Defense University here in Washington, D.C., where his focus is on maritime affairs, as you might have guessed from the beautiful waves on the cover of his book here. Some previous roles of his, including, among many, many others, include time as a visiting fellow at Sciences Po in Paris, a Fulbright Hays grant to teach international relations in Iraq, a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship to Istanbul, and a presidential scholarship at the American University in Cairo. He is the author of Gulf Security and the U.S. Military, Regime Survival and the Politics of Basing, and the editor of several other books as well. His latest book, however, is the one that we are here to discuss. It just came out from Yale University Press last fall, and is called To Rule Eurasia's Waves, The New Great Power Competition at Sea. And rather than going into the details of this book, I'm going to let him take it over from here and go into all of that with you. So Geoffrey, over to you.
Jordan, thanks very much. It's a real honor to be here. Thanks to those who are squeezing in their lunch hour to come listen. So my intent here is to go about 35, 40 minutes. And then the question and answer session is always most fun for me. Before I jump in, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, I need to put the disclaimer just to be on the safe side that the views expressed here are those of my own. They do not represent those of the United States government, the Department of Defense, or National Defense University. With that, let's jump in. So let me start by showing what really interested me in this larger project. So I rewind to 2017. And in 2017, Russia and China hosted what they call the Joint Sea Exercise. You can see on the right, it was held in the far western stretches of Eurasia or Western Europe in the Baltic Sea, and then also in the far eastern reaches of Eurasia in the Sea of Okhotsk. China and Russia have been engaging with these joint sea exercises and increasing their purview and extension since 2012. In 2015, they also, for the first time, exercise in the Mediterranean, so very significant. And after this visit or this exercise, the Chinese PLA Navy descended down into other parts of Europe, making a historic first visit to London, as well as other parts of Europe. So it began to kind of trigger what's going on here. How do these exercises represent a larger trend? In addition to that, and in juxtaposition to the joint sea exercises, what we've seen going on with India and hosting of its Malabar exercise. And here you can see in 2016, pushing further into East Asia than we've ever seen before. And then most recently, this past fall, it hosted its Malabar exercise in the Bay of Bengal, where it invited Australia for the first time since 2007. And as we know, several years prior, They invited Japan in as as an additional permanent member. The United States has always been involved, and so for the first time, we're seeing though the Quad on the high seas, if you will, and representing kind of this larger maritime shifting dynamic between these various powers. So that kind of pushed me to look at what are some of these bigger trends going on in the greater Eurasia continent. And this, of course, I put up the map as someone who's been always interested in geography and knowing and studying Eurasia, that obviously we look at it primarily from a territorial perspective. And it makes sense, right? What's going on in Central Asia and Central Eurasia, our presence until recently being more robust in Afghanistan. But of course, the analysis primarily looks at it in an inward looking fashion. So, what I'm attempting to do here is to reverse that, a paradigm shift, if you will, to focus on the maritime space. And if we look back at historic geographers, one that first comes into mind is Nicholas Speakman, who says, "Who controls the rimland rules Eurasia. Who controls Eurasia controls the destinies of the world." And of course, he was playing on the work of Sir Halford Mackinder, who looked at the world island, who looked at the heartland or the pivot of history, and seeing how that was more important. And here, Speakman was writing in the height of the Second World War, looking at the rise of Nazi Germany, as well as in the Far East Imperial Japan, and how they viewed Eurasia, but seeing that the rimlands were equally as important as the heartland taken together. But what these geographers and even Alfred Thayer Mahan, for his part, the great sea power theorist, didn't account for what we're seeing today, and that's of an increasingly melting Arctic. So what I wanted to push is, again, to shift the way we look and see and study Eurasia, for that matter, and see what's going on in the maritime domain. And again, it's not to say, and we'll talk more about the Arctic at the end, that the Arctic is going to be open. But I think in terms of the longer trends, we'll see it, and we have seen it increasingly open for longer stretches of time throughout the year, and pushing a greater unification of Eurasia on the high seas around the outer rim, if you will. Some other trends that, of course, we've been looking at in the past decade or so is that of a demographic bulge. And I love this graphic. There are more people living in this circle than outside. And of course, why, increasing the United States has tried to push more to Asia, to East Asia specifically, because of South Asia, Pakistan, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, China, others, really just with a expanding population. And in order to just at the basic level fuel the economies, provide resources for these populations that are growing, you have to, these countries specifically have to look outside of their territorial spaces to find resources to fuel the economy. Of course, and we'll talk more about this, thus representing China's Belt and Road Initiative since 2013. Of course, looking, territorially across the heartland of Eurasia being very important. But also, what I'm attempting here too is to look at China's maritime Silk Road, to see how it's expanded, to see where its investments, what the trajectory of their investments are over the long term. And I had an opportunity, we could talk about traveling to many places along this maritime Silk Road, stretching from Athens all the way into Singapore and East Asia. And of course, the Indian Ocean fits front and center in this. You have approximately 100,000 ships that traverse the Indian Ocean on an annual and regular basis, going through set sea lanes of communication. And as we know in the shipping industry, time is money. So it's very much, if you have to divert or go outside of these set routes, it's going to be more time, more money that's spent on shipping. And of course, any shipping company wants to make it the most efficient possible. But furthermore, as we'll delve into in moments here, the energy piece is very critical and central to this larger dynamic that we're seeing. But the Indian Ocean has emerged increasingly as a real focal point and arena for competition between these great powers. And this goes back to, again, looking at Eurasia from a maritime perspective. just seeing where China's begun to invest, but also India for that matter too, of being beholden to having goods. As we know, more than 90% or approximately 90% of goods are shipped via the sea. So thus, great reliance remains on goods that are coming in and out. And if anything happens to the cargo vessels that are traversing the sea lanes of communication, this could be detrimental to a country's economy. Three larger points that I want to hit upon here that I'll jump into, but just to summarize what I've seen or what I argue in the book of what is driving, what are the kind of main factors driving the increased embrace by the likes of China, Russia, and India in this larger maritime great power competition. The first being maritime geoeconomics, maritime trade and investment, energy security, as I noted. And an interesting element we'll talk here in a second about cyber and the sea, cables and information flows. The second main argument or point is this desire for great power status of the likes of India, Russia, China. And in the case of Russia and China in particular, trying to alter or undermine a US led world order. And that's leading to greater competition. But also, what we've seen as kind of subsequent secondary spillover is the rise of the phenomenon of navalism, greater naval development, weapons, cyber technology, ships, subs, carriers, greater naval activity, joint exercises, as we started out the Malabar exercise, the Joint Sea exercise, greater amounts of naval diplomacy and solo expeditions. And the last main point is securing Eurasia's sea lanes of communication. So, with greater investments in the maritime geoeconomic domain, it means a greater need to secure many of these assets. And thus, this going directly into basing access, port access, and we've seen increasing amounts of this activity along these sea lines in recent years. And of course, the last part being that of the frontier politics of the Arctic. So first in the maritime geoeconomics, we know, and it's not to say, that China's Belt and Road Initiative or the Maritime Silk Road that I've been more specifically focused upon, it's not been perfect, right? The rollout has had certain hit obstacles, hit other elements or roadblocks that has made it difficult. But the by and larger trend is seeing a significant establishment of a foothold or at least an agreement or investment in this growing maritime port network that really assists in China developing a more efficient supply and logistics chain network that traverses certainly the southern confines of maritime Eurasia. And this, of course, is highlighted by, there's some of the biggest ports are, as we know, located in East Asia. And you can see top one, Shanghai, Singapore, Shenzhen, and the list goes on and on. But why most of our goods are coming out of East Asia and why there's just, a growing focus on what we see going on in the far stretches of Eastern Eurasia. In addition to that, India also fits front and center in this discussion. And I think, and we can certainly engage much more, India's really grappled with just having the limited infrastructure to handle some of these VLCCs or very large cargo carriers come in. And as a result, and to offload stuff into India. And as a result, it has to transship the vast majority of goods that come in. Now, this is inefficient, but this is also more expensive. And as you can see on the side, 48% of India's trade is transshipped via Colombo, Sri Lanka, 29% via Singapore, 15% via Malaysia, 4% via the UAE. So it has to go outside, unload, put it into smaller ships before they can come in. Now, they've tried to invest more in the blue economy, bolstering the port infrastructure in India, but this is a real dilemma, especially as China begins to invest in some of these transshipped transit points, such as Colombo and Sri Lanka. Another phenomenon that we see in the maritime geoeconomic realm is that of fishing. And as we know, there are a lot of headlines about the Chinese fishing vessels. And here you can see some of the numbers. The consumption levels are staggering. primarily again coming from East Asia, but also the fact that the Chinese have developed a very strong global industrial fishing fleet that is largely subsidized by the Chinese government to the tune of around 3,000 vessels. This enables these vessels to just go to the farther reaches of the Indian Ocean and elsewhere, just scooping up as much fish. And this, from a climate ecological perspective, overfishing is a real dilemma, but an important economic engine for these growing populations. And of course, energy security is no surprise. The Strait of Hormuz being that of primarily where India, China, Japan, others rely upon getting oil and gas. But gas is a really fascinating one because you hear it's one of my favorite graphics. It shows the natural gas deposits, where the most heavily located natural gas deposits are. That, of course, you see deep red in the high north, in the Arctic for Russia, and of course the Southwest Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, no surprise. But there are two ways to get out oil and gas. One is via the sea and the other is via pipeline. So via the sea is still going to remain an important element when transporting. This is why, and we'll talk more in a second about why China is investing more, Russia is investing more. It hasn't been a perfect rollout, certainly, but as the Arctic begins to melt more, the geoeconomic piece becomes really critical. And here you can see some more specific numbers on the state of where India gets most of its oil imports, competing with China, in Southwest Asia, for example, in Africa, for that matter, and then of course where China gets the bulk of its crude imports too, of really trying to diversify. Because for China too, what you'll frequently hear is the Malacca dilemma. Of if the Strait of Malacca is shut down, not only trade will be stopped, but also energy supplies, again coming from the Middle East and Africa, and so wanting to diversify away from that in the event of the outbreak of conflict. Here, I recognize lots of spaghetti string lines. These represent the submarine network cables that line the sea, that connect us via the internet the world over. And the oft cited statistic, which is always so fascinating to me, is that there are approximately 200 submarine cables that line the world to connect us, all countries around the world. Only 200. Around 95% of all our internet traffic traverses these submarine cables. So, just from an infrastructure point alone, they're critical to protect. And if anything goes wrong, this is a problematic from our connection to today to all other forms of communication. Now, the Chinese in particular have been very smart about trying to lay resilience cables. We frequently hear reference to the peace cable, which is the Pakistan, East Africa, Connect to Europe cable, or the CWE Southeast Asia, Middle East, Western Europe cable that has been successfully laid in the last couple of years alone from France through the Suez Canal to Djibouti, into other spots in the Western Indian Ocean, with the ultimate intent of laying it all the way into East Asia, which, and you can follow this. There's some great maps that show these various cables that are connecting. So China is understanding that in order to really, power is information, and having resiliency and telecommunication through these underlying sea cables is critical. And it's not dissimilar to what we see historically with the British laying of the All Red cable in 1902, I believe, that connected via telegraph all the outlying colonies around the world. So we see a similar dynamic going on in China, trying to legitimately, again, it makes good sense from an economic standpoint. Russia doing the same thing, where just recently announced China actually had tried to, I think it's still in certain negotiations, but I believe Russia successfully concluded an agreement with Finland in the submarine cable agreement. And to give you a good perspective, there are only approximately two submarine networked cables that go in and out of Russia to connect it to the greater, World Wide Web. So having additional cables certainly makes good sense. And you compare this to a country like Djibouti that has an estimated 7 or 8 cables that come in from from the deep sea into Djibouti, and off into the rest of Africa. So very critical, the laying of these cables. And this, I want to show, again, this is kind of the beginning. Here I only focus primarily on these continental, maritime competition when it comes to China, India, and Russia. But as you can see, China very much a bigger vision when it comes to looking to the Antarctic, investing in the Antarctic, as well as the Arctic from a research and development standpoint. Of course, from the Antarctic, jumping off into Latin America. So clearly, just a big, grand strategic vision. All right, from maritime geoeconomics, we shift now to this desire for great power status. Some of these graphics are not going to be exactly, on point. You might quibble with some of the stats and figures. That's more than okay. It's more as a learning tool to show you some of these kind of trends in military development or investment in a blue water navy. And what we're seeing as the countries want to, want to achieve great power status, when it comes to constructing a blue water navy, there's an element of prestige to this. There's a reason why the likes of India, for example, wants to invest heavily in having an aircraft carrier, because it shows that I too am just like the United States or other great powers, that shows my ability to project power far and wide, and thus why in wanting to invest in these capabilities and platforms. But the spillover effect from this is increased navalism. This the real kind of national sentiment of supporting greater naval development, naval diplomacy efforts, seeing the kind of second and third order effects that can come. But the challenge therein is that there could be more great and greater aggression on the high seas, sometimes in congested waterways like choke points. But it's the ultimate inadvertent potential or possibility for the inadvertent outbreak of conflict that could be devastating, and ultimately escalate into something more significant. Now, Russia's naval development programs certainly hit many, many challenges, to say the least. Even its submarine program has had tragic disaster. That being said, it has maintained, um, the development of its submarine capabilities. And to put it in perspective, they currently have around 72 submarines, per, I think, 2018 data. But right now, currently, they have, I think, 6 different classes of submarines that are under construction, under planning, compared to the United States that has just one class of submarine that's under development. So this shows, and it recognizes, Russia recognizes how powerful the stealth element of submarines can be in terms of projecting power or gathering intelligence. But also when we talk about anti-access area denial, or A2AD, my understanding is that submarines are the best platforms to kind of penetrate, and not be as exposed to certain areas that have an increasing or growing strength from an A2AD perspective. Here you can see, again, numbers on the China perspective. This comes from an Indian newspaper, so there's certain bias there. But to show you, India currently has around 130, 137. China, although some numbers put it closer to 300, perhaps more aspirational, but if you throw in, the maritime militia or the Coast Guard, those numbers could be higher. So all this kind of push and drive to invest more in navies has become a real, consistent characteristic that we've seen in the last, 5 or more years, last decade or so. And then this leads to the third main element: securing the sea lanes of communication. Since 2014, Russia really solidified its power in the Black Sea. And that has enabled it to jump and catapult further down into the Eastern Mediterranean, with the more permanent establishment of a base in Tartus, in Latakia, and then, of course, pushing even further south into the Red Sea. We can see just the recent news this past fall, I believe in November, where the Russians, they've been negotiating over the past year or so, established a base for around 300 personnel and 4 warships. And this, of course, is just north of the famous Djibouti that houses China's first overseas base, Japan's first overseas base, the United States' largest African presence in Camp Lemonnier. The French, of course, have a presence. Other EU actors have a presence. The Italians, of course, because Djibouti is not only an important jumping off point into the rest of Africa, but sitting at the Bab el Mandeb is also critical from a geostrategic standpoint. Now, if we shift further to the east, you can again see just the real dilemma, not only for India that relies on so much of the trade, but certainly the East Asian countries, excuse me, such as China, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, that rely upon the energy resources that are coming from the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. And then you run into this gauntlet of the South China Sea, the contested islands. You can see here on the map, but also the concern for the United States is that it would, if there's, God forbid, the outbreak of a conflict over Taiwan or another disputed island, this would be very challenging for the United States because China, over the past decade or more, has really beefed up its A2AD capabilities such that if the United States went in there with a ship, it's, all communications would be shut down. It'd be more or less a sitting duck in certain parts of the South China Sea. And so this is of growing concern for not only East Asian countries, but also the United States as it weathers, kind of projects forward about how to posture its force amidst a real changing dynamic in South China Sea. Now let's shift last to the final frontier, and we can certainly come back to any of these elements in the question and answer. I recognize that I'm certainly moving quickly to cover a vast amount of material. So last is the Arctic, and this indeed, for right now, is very much about geoeconomics. From a fishery standpoint, 240 approximately fish and shellfish species, and of course, as the seawater, the temperatures of the ocean increase, a lot of these fish are moving further north. For those who've read the great book on the history of cod, which is a wonderful book, cod and the great varieties rely upon a much colder temperature of ocean, and so if you get rising temperatures, they're going to increasingly move to the north, and so this means that more countries are going to be looking to the Arctic to try to just do more fishing. In addition to that, the shipping industry is very excited about the potential. Again, it's not going to be open, year round anytime soon, but even just this past year, it was open. The Northern Sea Route specifically was open for something like 122 days, which was the most that has been open in any given year in recent history. And so the potential for shaving off, as I put up at the top here, that a one-way trip by going through the Northern Sea Route as opposed to through the Strait of Malacca up to the Suez Canal into Western Europe could shave off $500,000. Time is money. And of course, shaving off around 30% of days on the high seas. Now, of course, it's tricky, certainly in the Northwest Passage because of the icebergs and certainly in the Northern Sea Route. But as you can see, if the Arctic continues to melt and speed up its opening, there's real potential from a geoeconomic standpoint. Right now, of course, icebreakers are critical. The United States as an Arctic power, we've really fallen behind in terms of how we're investing in the Arctic, although perhaps that's shifting. But you can see just in terms of how we've invested in icebreakers, it says 3 there, 2 privately owned, but really of the 3, only 2 are kind of in working condition and 1, in more regularity compared to other countries and even China as a non-Arctic power. but you can see how there's just such great potential as to why China would want to become more ingrained and more integrated into what's going on in the high north because of, as you can see here in this map again, oil and gas, fisheries, and then as we have in this next slide, just a real significant amount of mineral resources. For Russia specifically, stands to gain huge amounts. 99% of Russia's diamonds, 96% of its platinum, 90% of its nickel and cobalt, among other rare earth metals. And this is, money, investment, just the repercussions are great and understandable. Now, in line with this, the concern is there's a growing militarization of the Arctic. Now, say for right now, Russia's been pretty good about working through the Arctic Council to really manage the larger governance of the central, Arctic zone. But over time, the fear is as it invests more in these various former bases or outposts or research and development posts, there's a growing securitization, which is of greatest concern for the United States and others. And here's a perspective on the right from Senator Sullivan's office in Alaska. The U.S. is moving, I would say, to try to look more at how they manage the Arctic. For right now, I think there's more economics tied up than anything else. But I think there's an event that just occurred, an incident, if you will, in August 2020. That was reported upon last fall during Ocean Shield, where the Russians were hosting their own exercise with 50 warships, and they crossed over into the US EEZs and started harassing US fishing vessels and told them, hey, it's time for you to go back to shore, otherwise you're going to face the consequences. And the US fishing vessels getting on the line back to the US Coast Guard saying, hey, is this real? Do we really need to be worried about this? And the US Coast Guard responding and saying, yeah, it is real. There's not much we can really do, but we do suggest that you come back to home port, if you will. So this was a very concerning event. It gets at the growing trends of possible navalism, of tension, of more aggression, as Russia, as China, as India, for that matter, invest more in these capabilities that bring them around Maritime Eurasia. Now, of course, I want to put in a plug here. I haven't focused much on the United States, and that was not the intent of the book, but I certainly want to put out this point to put it into even greater perspective. It's not to say that the United States is going away anytime soon, and certainly we can talk more about this, but I do want to show, a case in point of we per every year or every couple of years, if you will, the United States Department of Defense puts out their base structure report that shows how many main operating bases are located around the world. There's a lot of semantics in how we define basing. So, the numbers could be much bigger, smaller, depending on where we're located at the time or what war, in the case of Afghanistan. Here's a snapshot view from 2015. This shows, you can see the higher percentage of basing. They aren't necessarily main operating bases, but could be also smaller installations. Nevertheless, in 2018, the number that came out was around 500, 512 main operating bases for the United States around the globe. But the issue, I think, especially for the incoming Biden administration, is that in a resource constrained environment, these bases are very expensive. And so it'll be incumbent upon the United States and policymakers to think about how they use their basing effectively and from a financially resource effective manner, positioning themselves for this growing, heightened maritime great power competition, especially across the southern confines of maritime Eurasia. This will be very critical. So, In some, and I greatly look forward to the question and answer. I want to come back to where I started in the beginning of looking at Eurasia and trying to make a case here in a short amount of time to really flip our paradigm of how we study and analyze Eurasia. Certainly, the territorial inward looking is important, but I've hoped to make the case here today is that as the Arctic increasingly melts, increasingly opens up for business. This really puts Russia and China, for that matter, as they are, increasingly investing in the geoeconomic realm and ports and the extraction of offshore energy, in the laying of cables. It's creating a new dynamic that is very much global in scale, very much something that we need to think about. So with that, thanks again for the opportunity to be here today, and I greatly look forward to your questions and comments. Back to you, Jordan.
Thank you so much. All right, folks. Once again, you can either put your questions in the chat and we will ask them out loud, or feel free to use the raise hand function on Zoom and ask your questions out loud yourself. All right, Robert, I see you have a question.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the presentation today. My question is, I guess I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on the Northwest Passage. So obviously the Northern Sea Route has gotten a lot of attention and seems to be the focus of Arctic discussions vis-a-vis Russia and China. But it seems that if there's melting in the Northwest Passage as well, I've read a bit about this, that would also bode well for the United States and Canada, as it's clearly within the North American sphere of influence. So again, if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what you see the forecast being for the Northwest Passage, especially in terms of like travel times, future security implications, as well as just kind of how those two, I guess that dynamic between both sea routes, I guess, becoming more navigable. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So my understanding is the Northwest Passage is not, it's a much harder passageway to traverse even during, more open times. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is critical. So you're right. There could be an ability for the United States and Canada, for that matter, to take advantage. However, it all ties back to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. And as we know, the United States has not ratified the treaty, although it recognizes it as customary international law. That being said, there is a clause, I believe it's Article 234, that has to do with ice-covered waters. And this also applies to Russia, for that matter, and a potential, one of the things it talks about is trying to kind of wedge apart, China and Russia, for that matter. They clear to be more closely aligned. But as we know, Russia and China have a deep, complex historical relationship. Nevertheless, this clause in UNCLOS is going to be very critical, because right now there's a certain interpretation of being ice-covered waters that will change if then they are opened up and is not ice-covered waters, and that it could be conceived as international right or passage, but a Canada and or a Russia might interpret it very differently and say, no, these are still our territorial seas. So until the United States and Canada, and more importantly, the United States ratifies it, which is not likely anytime soon, there's still going to be kind of that needs to be sorted out front and center before any kind of great taking advantage of the Northwest Passage takes place. Back to you, Jordan.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that question, and Geoffrey for the response. Who else has questions for our lovely speaker today? I know you all must have something. Either that or you have answered all of their questions preemptively. So I guess I'll ask a question of my own, which is, what is the one, it's a question of a sort. What's the question you wish people would ask you about this topic?
You know, that's a good one. So I think, um, I think looking forward, and that's why I put on the graphic there, it's the French map in terms of, hey, what are the longer term repercussions or things to think about? No, certainly it's not downplay what's going on in East Asia. I think what's going on in East Asia is very troubling, and perhaps will ratchet up uh, to the point where who knows what'll happen, or the Indian Ocean. There's lots going on there, but I think focusing on the Arctic is very important. But furthermore, looking at the Antarctic and appreciating just how robust the Chinese research and development um, focus is, but in addition to that, how much Latin America is quickly becoming more of a Chinese focus. So certainly here for the book, I look at primarily Eurasia, and going all the way into Western Europe. But I think over the long term, if the trends prevail, and this is the difficulty and the dilemma, I think, for the United States in particular, and that is, as I point out, front and center, the primary argument is it's geoeconomically motivated. So of course, China or Russia or whomever, India for that matter, yeah, we want to invest. We see it as a good investment, a good return on investment. But then there's the dual use nature of a lot of these ports. Djibouti is a really interesting one, for example, that I had a chance to go to. Hopefully, some of you have been or will have a chance to go, because it's so, behind the scenes, there's so much of a heavy Chinese footprint investing in all elements. But I think in terms of longer trends, I think continue to focus on the maritime space, especially as the Chinese move beyond just kind of the Eurasia continent.
Thanks so much. And Gabriella, I see you have a question.
Hi, Dr. Gesh, Gabriella DeVita, first year SSP student. I wanted to know if you had any familiarity, especially around DJ, with the plans NETIFs, the Naval Expeditionary Task Force that they've been sending probably the last 4 or 5 years over there. I know it's advertised and publicized in the maritime community as being sort of a counter-piracy mission, but as you're speaking about DJ and the infrastructure that they have, especially around the Horn of Africa, what do you think some of the alternate agendas of China is, or China are having that mission set in the HOA there? Do you think it's keeping an eye on their infrastructure in DJ, or maybe looking at the US activity or other coalition activity just north of the ME?
Yeah, it's a great question. It goes back to 2009 when uh, an international coalition was put together, as you know, for counter piracy operations, as exhibited by CTF 151 and CTF 150, War in the Gulf. And that has really been important for China. And I think up until recently, I think many made the argument to say, and many Europeans made this argument too, of, what, we'd rather have China in the tent where we can then manage and work with them, as opposed to automatically pushing them outside the tent. Now, since then, the conversation have shifted. There's been, trust issues, if you will. But from a Chinese perspective, uh, again, having a base, and as someone who's studied, my first book was about base politics, as Jordan mentioned. So it's a topic of real interest to me, of why do countries establish bases? Well, they establish bases because they have growing interests, and in a lot of instances, they have growing economic interests. And so, in the case of China here again, what was such a monumental or triggering event was 2011, I think. Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown from Libya. The Chinese at the time had how many foreign nationals working in Libya? 36,000 foreign nationals. How do you rescue 36,000 foreign nationals from Libya? You can't fly them out. You got to get ships there. And so the Chinese felt very flat footed. And furthermore, they had to go to the Greeks or to Greece and rent ships to then extract their personnel or foreign nationals, if you will. That also happened in a similar fashion, although in a much smaller space in Yemen. So basically, since those two events occurred, China said we never want to confront a dynamic where we can't rescue our own people or secure our own assets. And so thus began kind of this growing focus and intent. And China has been very smart. They've learned from the United States in some respects. The challenging dynamic that comes with base politics. That is the relationship between the host nation and the basing nation. And so here, China, and I engage with various Chinese scholars or academics or officials, whatever, uh, and how they would say up until the official establishment in 2017, well, it's just a supply and logistics hub. It's nothing more. And then quickly, obviously, knowing what was coming, and that of the establishment of a base. And again, and that's why I put the map at the end showing the United States. We're not going anywhere. There's 500 plus bases around the world. China's established how many bases? One base. Japan established, how many bases? One base. So I think we need to put it in perspective and not entirely. I think some hyperventilate. That all aside, there is reason to be concerned because a lot of times the geoeconomic investment can morph into something else. And let's go to Sri Lanka, for example. And the Chinese helped to build a big telecommunications telecommunications tower. Looks like a big lotus flower in downtown Colombo. The allegation was that it was the PLA helped to construct this telecommunications tower. And so that kind of bleeds in this weird gray area where it might not be a direct footprint, if you will, from a military standpoint, but there are all these other tentacles. So it's a delicate balance for sure. And I think certainly over the past several years, the United States has really upped its game in trying to manage what these dynamics and what these investments actually mean. But it's still a delicate dance, if you will. And Djibouti highlights that front and center because it is this critical jumping off point into the rest of Africa, let alone up into the Mediterranean and Western Europe too.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Gabriella. And I see we have one hand raised and then one question in the chat. After that, we might have time to squeeze in one more question. So if you've got one itching at the back of your mind, go ahead and throw it in the chat or get your hand raised real quick. Justin, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. My question was, we've seen recently some pushback towards China's Belt and Road Initiative, especially when it comes to overseas basing, vice just economic investment. And I was wondering if you thought that movement would continue to where China is being kind of hamstrung by these countries they're investing in, or do you think Chinese economic power will kind of take over and they'll proceed as they have been for the last few years?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you have to kind of take it on a country by country, case by case basis. And again, I think where China's been very smart is that it doesn't necessarily need to have this huge proliferation of, for now at least, huge proliferation of maritime bases. So I think just focusing on really shoring up this maritime port supply and logistics network is pretty significant in its own right. And I look, to a place like Piraeus, Greece, where Costco shipping has really enhanced the investments in the port. It's now become one of the top regional ports. Of course, it's a jumping off point into other parts of Eastern and Western Europe. But as pointed out to me there too, that in the winter months in particular, it's an enormous cruising tourism hub. And so this can also double as and they haven't, or they maybe had, random visits here and there. But the Chinese, if they wanted down the road, could likely then rent the space where the cruise ships are normally during the winter months of up to 6 months, perhaps. So this quickly becomes, a different dynamic. But more importantly, based upon the Djibouti experience, saying that it's a supply and logistics node, this is not an official base, if you will. We're doing replenishment, we're doing ship repair. These are all logical elements. And I think there's good reason why China waited until 2017 to really roll out and say we're establishing a formal base in Djibouti. But you can look at Greece as being one example, but then go to another counterexample in Pakistan and the China-Pakistan economic corridor that's been much discussed is very significant for the Chinese. The Pakistanis have hit real, their ability to pay back, and this is consistent challenges for the Pakistanis. But nevertheless, there's all this discussion about Gwadar. Well, what is Gwadar? What could it be? I think the Chinese are realizing they've seen engineers and others be killed by, local insurgency headed by the Baluch. So they recognize that there's a tension that comes with this, and for now, there's always discussion that that'll probably be the next node, and I think even from the submarine cable standpoint, I believe they've been successful in laying the submarine cable that connects with the rest to Gwadar specifically, and then off into the Maldives. So I think, for the moment, there's not a need to have this huge expansion of basing. They're being very slow and methodical about it, and I think that's probably the right way because of realizing just how delicate, and the United States faces all the time, Saudi Arabia being a good case of this pushback, this blowback for having a US military presence in a country where it's not wanted.
Thank you. And we have just a few minutes, so I'm going to jump straight to our question from the chat. From Sophia, what are your thoughts on infrastructure adaptation for port assets and sea level rise?
Yeah, I think that is not as much in the conversation as it should be. Although this is pretty fascinating anecdotal evidence, right? So there's another port that's often discussed, that of Hambantota, right? The famous Hambantota that has very little traffic. But what's interesting is that if the Chinese are good, they're good at many things, certainly. But one of the things they're great at is making man-made islands. So they, dredging up the port to make it deeper for vessels to be able to come in and out. They had extra sand, and they developed a very small, I think, 0.75 kilometer little island outside of Hambantota port. It's grass. It's nothing significant. But then you get into the question of, well, who owns the island? Who's going to control the island? It's technically outside the jurisdiction of Hambantota. It's kind of unclear, but it looks like China is still going to kind of own, control that island. But the piece here that goes back to your question related to climate change, the Chinese built and are prepared for sea level rise to, I think I cited it in the book, it's like 40 feet, that they made sure that it was, over the long several decades, because that's the impressive thing about, compared to other countries, they look out on the long-term horizon. And so they have already planned for sea level rise in places like Hambantota, which gets at the significance of really the long-term thinking. All that said, if I put a plug in, I did an edited volume a couple of years ago called Eurasia's Maritime Rise. So there's a theme with me, clearly. But there's a good article in that looks at the Pearl River Delta and how sea level rises are adversely affecting manufacturing plants and that China is not, or at least a couple of years ago, wasn't adequately focused on how climate change was going to inundate and alter its trade patterns. So I think it's a really important, clearly, that is the future. But I would imagine, based upon my anecdotal experience in Hambantota, you can better believe that the Chinese are really thinking about, and certainly, look at another example, the Maldives, another fascinating case where the Chinese helped to put together a reclaimed man-made island. Because the Maldives is sadly sinking into the Indian Ocean, has greater issues with coastal erosion and just inundation of salt water. And so these projects and they become uh, so professional at making these man-made islands, or thinking about how they reposition, and the Maldives represents that front and center of preparing for the future of sea level rises.
Thank you. And we have one more question to sneak in before 1 o'clock from John. Is there a greater naval role to play for Germany as the most powerful EU economy in the Indo-Pacific region, especially in cooperation with India, Taiwan, and Japan?
So that's a good question. I mean, Germany is an interesting case. Another project I've been working on is looking at his history of great maritime powers. And Germany certainly had a moment from a technological standpoint, but in general, as we know, or unless you go back to the Hanseatic League, but Germany has not always been a robust maritime power. It's not to say, I think Europe, you're beginning to see more of Europe awaken to the fact that it needs to be more involved in kind of Indian Ocean politics specifically. I saw Germany when I was in Djibouti. Germany deployed certain troops to the counter piracy exercises. They had constant, I think, a team or rotation. So I think there's always more for Europeans in general to be more integrated into some of the larger dynamics. And I think part of the challenge, we've already seen this over the last 4 years, the Europeans and others, Japan, for example, have begun to question, how much is the United States going to be involved? How much do we need to take a more proactive role in kind of offsetting, maybe perhaps where there's more of a vacuum? So I think you're seeing more European powers discuss about, hey, what's the Quad? France giving access to India to some of its former colonial outposts in the Indian Ocean. So I think there's certainly a role for Germany to play there too. But because Germany doesn't have the same legacy in the Indian Ocean, I think it's not in the same footing compared to that of the British or the French. But because it's the EU, I think there's great potential there.
Thank you so much. And I know folks are probably wrapping up their lunch hours right around now. So we too will wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone. Dr. Geoffrey Gresh is the author of the new book, To Rule Eurasia's Waves, the New Great Power Competition at Sea. That's what we've been talking about. And if you're interested in learning more about the topic, definitely check it out. Thank you again, Dr. Gresh.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, and best wishes with the start or forthcoming spring semester.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everyone.
Take care.